everyone, Karl Bainbridge here, welcoming you back to INC Live. First off, I want to say a big thank you to everybody who has been supporting the channel over these past few weeks. We're hoping to try and expand it with a few more interviews and a few more additional segments so we can make the live element of this channel just as big as the normal INC page. I'm glad I've actually finally got the opportunity, bearing in mind my weekend, to talk about UFC 266. International Fight Week is now in our rearview mirror. We had 2 title fights as well as the return of Nick Diaz. How did it all play out? Let's get to the fights. Now, I want to stress before I start that I have not prepared any notes for this. I've had a few minutes or so to sort of think about what I could potentially say, but there is no scripting to this segment. I had a lot of people criticize me for doing so when I first started this, so this is purely ad-lib. This is all off the tongue. If I splutter at any point, that's just the perils of live television as well. With that being said, let's talk about the big story coming out of this show, which was that main event. Alex Volkanovski beating Brian Ortega by a unanimous decision after a fight that many people are calling one of the best in featherweight history. Would I personally go that far? I personally think Aldo versus Chad Mendes was maybe a little bit better, but it is worthy of a lot of praise. Now, the first 2 rounds played out the way I sort of expected it to. Even though Brian Ortega has made some substantial improvements to his striking game, you compare him to, say, the Volkanovskis and the Max Holloways of the world, he is still many levels below them, even though as good as that performance against Korean Zombie was, especially when it comes to his striking defense. And I think in those first 2 rounds, we saw those sort of ailments of Brian playing out. Volkanovski was just powering out the jab, just staying on the outside, and because Brian has this tendency to take on board a lot of damage, he was getting pieced up a lot, and I had a feeling that that was the fight that was going to play out. We were going to get that sort of a rather unremarkable point fight with Volkanovski claiming that 50-45. Then that 3rd round happens. And if I wanted to try and introduce someone to mixed martial arts and say why I love this sport, one of the big reasons I love it personally is the unpredictability. The fact that you can have a guy who is getting dominated for a substantial amount of time in a fight, and then through one mistake and one clutch move, he can finish it off. And Brian Ortega finally getting Volkanovski to the ground and locking in that guillotine, and that was a hell of a tight guillotine as well, to very nearly finish the fight after being on the back foot for so long. That would have been an incredible finish. And you could hear the crowd. The crowd was sort of a bit nonchalant about the fight going into the 3rd. That fired them up because they knew there was a big opportunity. There was a big wow moment coming here. But Volkanovski, to his credit, I have seen fighters tap out to far less dangerous submissions than that. I mean, you look at someone like, say, Jean Valente versus Maurice Green, and you tap out to that. And yet Volkanovski can survive that guillotine and still power through. And then, of course, Brian throws up a triangle as well. People forget that the triangle was quite tight as well. He comes back. He nearly finishes Brian Ortega in the 3rd round. Personally, I don't think Brian should have come out for the 4th because he looked absolutely destroyed by the end of that. I think it's a testimony to both men. Like Brian Ortega, someone described it on social media, and I sort of understand where they're coming from this. Brian Ortega is the grappling version of Derek Lewis, because he can lose 95% of a fight and at times look very below elite level in doing so. But you give him one opportunity on the ground, he can finish a fight like that. And I think there's a lot of people who... I personally always been quite high on Brian Ortega. The fight that really won him over for me was when he submitted Cub Swanson. I thought he is a guy who, if he can round out some elements of his game, he can stay around that sort of top 5, top 3 sort of region. His stock has raised thanks to this performance. And personally, I thought he won the 5th round as well. Because he came on, he realised, hey, I've got to try and do something in the 5th round. I know 2 of the judges didn't think that way. I think one of them scored at 50-44, which must have been because of that 3rd round and how close Volkanovski came to finishing. I personally thought he won the final round. When a fighter loses a fight, and especially one that loses 50-45 or 50-44, and still comes out of the match with his stock raised higher, that to me is a testimony to how good this match was. But not only has Brian Ortega's stock risen, obviously Volkanovski's has as well. because a lot of people forget this going into this fight. Alex Volkanovski is not a popular fighter. I mean, I think the hardcore fans, like the purists, can appreciate his skill set. But to the sort of everyday average Joe, he's international, he's Australian, so I don't think he pulls to a primarily American audience. There's the issue surrounding the Max Holloway fight as well. A lot of people think he didn't deserve to win the second fight. I don't agree with that. I thought he did win. And you can hear that with the crowd as well. He got booed on his way out to the arena. There were chants for Brian Ortega. I think I heard some Max Holloway chants as well during the fight. His performance, hopefully, is that sort of catalyst to make people respect and appreciate how good this guy is. I would personally have him as the number 2 pound for pound behind Kamaru Usman. And in the same way that Usman finally won people's respect when he knocked out Jorge Masvidal, hopefully this is the performance that makes people realise, hey, Alex Volkanovski is worthy of this appreciation. Might not be the most glamorous fighter, might not be a specialist in the way that someone like an Adesanya is. He is a bit of a wrestle boxer, which is a bit of a dull fight. I wouldn't say dull fighting style, that's maybe the wrong way to put it, but it's conventional. Wrestle boxing is sort of like your sort of go-to MMA character type, which can get a little bit tedious. But he's a hell of a good wrestle boxer. He's Chad Mendes rounded out and sort of refined. And all roads point towards him fighting Max Holloway again. I think that's what the UFC want. Obviously, Max has got to get through Yair Rodriguez, which is not going to be as easy for Max as what a lot of people think it is. But I'm really looking forward to that fight. I think you've got 2 great featherweight fighters who are leaps and bounds ahead of everyone else. Unfortunately for the rest of the division, they're going to have to be put on the back burner. Hopefully we can get Zabit back, or someone like an Arnold Allen can maybe make a run to the title fight. These 2 fighters are worthy of so much praise as they got, and I think Alex Volkanovski especially has finally made people realise just how good he actually is. The guy's won 20 fights. I mean, what is it? I think it's like a 25 winning streak or a 17-fight winning streak, something like that. This is not a bad fighter. This is not a guy who was locked into title contention and was the beneficiary of a lucky Max Holloway decision. He is legitimately talented. And thankfully, a lot of people are coming around to that. Fantastic fight. The last 3 rounds were amazing to watch. It turned what was, I think, a sort of ho-hum run-of-the-mill fight into a great one. It's well worth rewatching if you missed it on Saturday. Of course, the big fight that a lot of people were looking forward to was Nick Diaz's return after 6 years away from the sport. He was going to be taking on a guy who he'd beaten in Robbie Lawler back in 2004. And if you looked at the analytics on YouTube, if you looked at all the social media posts, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, anything relating to Diaz versus Lawler was doing like 10 times as much as the main event. So it's safe to say this was the casuals' main event. This was the fight that most people on the streets were looking forward to. Truth be told though, I wasn't as high on this fight as a lot of other people were. And I say that for 2 reasons. One, I wasn't really a massive fan of the sport when Nick was first around. So I didn't really buy into sort of like the Nick Diaz hype in the same way that sort of other fans were. I was aware of who he was. I'd look back at a lot of his other fights like Paul Daly, etc. Obviously Diaz Lawler won. So I understand from that perspective that we had an entertaining fighter. But I also was aware that this was a guy who was 38 years old, who'd been out of action for a long time, and I did have question marks over how good his performance was going to be. And especially as well against Robbie Lawler, who I'd seen a lot of Robbie's more recent fights. And again, another legend of the sport. I'm not discrediting it. But I watched that performance against Neil Magny. He looked like he didn't want to be there. He suffered from the same thing that Tyron Woodley did, where he seemed scared to throw. He seemed scared to try and make it a sort of dirty fight. So I was a little bit worried that the fight wasn't going to play out. I'll put it this way. For what this fight was, which was a sloppy old man brawl, I was entertained. The guys didn't have any sort of care for sort of the defensive elements of the game. I think one of the things that Nick did do well was he was working the body, which you don't see enough fighters trying to target the body as much. And that's always been a big Diaz trait. So I did like that element. But everything else, though, I hate to say it, I found it quite sad to watch, to be honest. Like, Nick looked so rusty and very slow. And I understand that from a money perspective, the UFC did the right thing, because obviously Diaz versus Lawler 2 was sort of like the big selling point for a lot of casual fans. It's the reason I think this card is going to do at least over 500,000 buys. But I honestly believe if you would put the words Triller, Bellator, BKFC, Golden Boy, you put one of those sort of lesser credible names atop of this fight, people would be crapping on it. I mean, it was not, in my opinion, and this is no disrespect to Nick Diaz or Robbie Lawler, in my opinion, it wasn't a UFC caliber fight. And considering the company prides itself on not jumping to all the gimmickry that some of the other promotions maybe do, I think they sort of did themselves a disservice by running this fight. Nostalgia, what this fight was for me was sort of, if you ever go to like a rock concert and you see like a great classic band from say the 1960s or the 1970s, yes, you're going to get a little bit of nostalgia. If you were around at that time, you might enjoy singing along to the hits, but the performance isn't going to be as slick. The voices are going to be croaky. You're going to get something which is a much more depleted version of that great band that you remembered from back then. And that's sort of what we got from Diaz versus Lawler. There were flashes of brilliance. There were parts of it I enjoyed. But I wasn't... It was tough to watch at times. And I think especially when you got to that stage when Nick, who I don't think came into the fight in shape, I think Robbie, to his credit, 38 years old, looked absolutely shredded. Nick looked out of shape. And I think by the third round, he just realised, hey, I've had enough. I want to give up. Which, in some ways, I sort of respect, because that was Nick realising, hey, this maybe isn't for me anymore. And I think that sort of, that attitude he had in the post-fight interview with Daniel Cormier sort of said to him that I think he realised, hey, I've had a go at this. I wanted to try and see if I could still do it. I've realised I can't. So I sort of give him credit for that. Obviously, I don't think Nick should be going on. I think that was a good way for him to sort of say, goodbye, I've done my bit. Thank you so much for all the support. Whether I want to do the same thing for Robbie, I think Robbie has got enough about him to still sort of do sort of the entertaining old man fight circuit. I would like to see him maybe rematch someone like a Matt Brown, for example. Carlos Condit before he retired. Someone of that sort of ilk, sort of like the old school welterweight brawlers. And there are a lot of them out there. And just have some fun fights. Like, Robbie is not... I don't want people to use Robbie the way that the UFC normally do, which is to sort of feed him to like an upcoming prospect so they can have the claim saying, hey, I beat former welterweight champion Robbie Lawler in an uncompetitive fight. Hendricks versus Costa, basically. Put him in some fun fights. Put him against guys who aren't going to try and take him down and just have a bit of fun. Robbie showed just enough, in my opinion, to show he's still got enough to be UFC worthy. Nick didn't, in my opinion. Co-main event, it's a hard one for me to judge because we all knew this fight wasn't going to be competitive. Shevchenko was like a minus 1400 for a reason, and as much as I do like Lauren Murphy, and as much as I've said for the past couple of weeks on social media that she deserves this title fight and that her sort of road to the belt was worthy of getting a lot of praise, this wasn't a competitive matchup. I think what Shevchenko did very well right from the start, and was also a flaw with Lauren's perspective, she made Lauren scared to throw. Because if you keep it at distance, Shevchenko's just going to piece you apart with your leg kicks and your body kicks. If you try and close distance, she's such a good counter striker, she's going to eat you coming in. So it made Lauren hesitant to throw. And unless Shevchenko makes a sort of colossal mistake, and to an extent she did, because there was that clash of feet and Shevchenko did stumble a little bit, which is sort of like one of the big sort of whoa moments of the fight, it's got to be honest. She was waiting for an opportunity which was never going to be there. I did see a lot of people online that were criticising Shevchenko, calling the fight boring, and I can sort of understand where they're coming from. It was clear from a very early stage that Shevchenko was a substantially better fighter. And when you have that sort of advantage, you should maybe want to try and exert your dominance and maybe do something in the same way you did with Andrade, where it was clear that Shevchenko was the better fighter in a lot of areas and she closed it out quite quickly. Instead, she waited to the fourth round And when the finish did come, it was very good. It's sort of the same sort of issue that we see with people like Cyril Gane, Leon Edwards, that sort of thing. Fundamentally, Shevchenko is fantastic to watch. The sort of intricacies of her striking game. But even though I personally appreciate that, a lot of people who love the sort of Muay Thai side of the sport like that, it's not appealing to the casual fans who just like the sort of wild, aggressive brawlers. And I did hear a lot of boos. I did see a lot of people criticizing online, but I can't criticize Shevchenko all that much because this was once again a dominant performance. And Jack Slack's probably going to hate me for saying this. I think we seriously need to consider Shevchenko now as the pound-for-pound best woman in the world. And I say this for a couple of reasons. If you look at the past 2 years and you compare Shevchenko to her nearest rival, she's had 4 title defenses, compared to her nearest rival who has had 0 legitimate title defenses, because I don't include women's featherweight. She has looked far better in those title matches, and even though you can maybe express some criticisms about Andrade, Chukagian, and Lauren Murphy, etc. as title challengers, those fighters are still a darn sight better than the Megan Andersons and Felicia Spencers of the world. So I think people need to seriously make that sort of consideration for Shevchenko. And I'm not going to be one of those people, though, who is going to say that Shevchenko is going to rule this division for the next 5 or 6 years. The sport's too unpredictable. There could be sort of like a female Hamzat sort of figure who just steamrolls through the division and ends up dominating Shevchenko and taking the belt. Shevchenko can have an off night. She can find that sort of stylistic nightmare coming down the road. In the short term, though, I'm looking at the people in the flyweight division. Now, flyweight has got a lot better than it was originally, but it's still not elite. And I was actually looking through the roster right now. And if you take away people who Shevchenko's beaten and people coming off a loss, the highest ranked fighter is Alexa Grasso at number 10. Now, Grasso's going to be fighting Jojo in November, I think, November 13th. The likelihood is the winner of that one is going to be facing Shevchenko next for the belt. So that could maybe be sort of like a March or April title defense, depending on how that fight plays out. And as much as I do like both girls, and personally I want to root for Jojo, obviously she's one of our own, being a Brit, I don't see either girl being competitive. And I think that's what we're going to be getting until we get that sort of next generation of fighters, such as the Tyler Santoses, the Manon Fiorellos of the world, coming to the fore and breaking into the top 5. So I think in the short term, Shevchenko is going to be a very formidable fighter to beat. And she's still got that drive. She's still got that motivation. I'm going against the grain though. I'm not too invested in seeing her fight at 135 again. It's more of a statement for me to just keep turning over contender after contender after contender than trying to go for that second belt. In terms of the rest of the card, in terms of some of the highlights, I think Chris Daukaus, great performance against Shamil Abdurakhimov. Basically won that fight twice because he knocked him out twice. I thought Shamil was maybe a bit too overranked, but give all credit where it's due. Chris Daukaus is now a top 7 fighter in the heavyweight division. And obviously being former Contender Series guy, having a story about being a policeman, he's going to get some sort of bigger opportunities because the UFC, they love the heavyweight. So I could see maybe a heavyweight main event on a fight night for him coming up soon. Jessica Andrade, always fantastic entertainment. Made easier work of Cynthia Calvillo than I thought it was going to be. I had I had Andrade winning that one, but I thought it was going to be by decision, that sort of ground and pound control sort of fight. And she made easy work of Cynthia Calvillo. She's one to try and go back down to strawweight. It's going to be interesting to see whether or not she sort of gets what she wants from the UFC, because I think the UFC is sort of more interested, in my opinion, on trying to bring through sort of like the Dern and Rodriguez winners. Strawweight's stacked. And whether Andrade can maybe try and claw her way back into that contention, that's going to be interesting to see. But very fun fighter. I love watching Jessica Andrade. She sort of reminds me a bit of sort of like a female Wanderlei, just the way she sort of like waits forward, rocking the body, and just wild swinging overhands whenever she gets a chance. Tyler Santos, good performance. Shame for Roxanne, who has just been facing some absolute killers recently. Matthew Semmelsberger, who wins the hair of the year and probably the knockout of the night as well, against Guy Martin Sano, who in my opinion, shouldn't have been in the UFC. There was a lot of stories that he was one of Nick's training partners, and that's basically how he ended up getting the contract with the UFC. On the whole, though, as we said plenty of times with these fight cards, which have been taking place with the crowd, even if the UFC fight nights themselves, the ones at the Apex, are maybe lacking in star power, they're only lacking because they're saving the juicy stuff for the crowded shows. And 266, obviously, it didn't play up to 261, which in my opinion is one of those sort of elite super cards that we're going to be talking about in the same way we do, say, 217 or UFC 189. This was a very, very good show. I was incredibly entertained. Maybe it needed the sort of superstar, star power main event to justify fight week, I should say. But the quality of that main event itself more than made up for it. As I mentioned before, thank you very much for joining me here at the INC Live Recap Show. My name has been Karl Bainbridge. Once again, please like, share, subscribe, ring the bell so you never miss a video. As you can plainly see, based on the fact that I've got all the mood lighting going on here, it is getting incredibly dark. So I'm going to get this video finished, and I hope that you can join me again on Sunday or Monday whenever I get the video uploaded, where we will be discussing UFC Fight Night, Johnny Walker taking on Thiago Santos, two Brazilian brawlers. Which one is going to come out on top? This is the INC. Thank you for watching.